Wu of Han, the emperor who reached the limits of empire. Welcome, and thank you to everyone who has been supporting our project. Each like, each new subscriber, gives us strength to continue producing these historical documentaries. If you enjoy history told without unnecessary detours, subscribe and join us. We bring new stories every day. Tell us in the comments which historical figure you would like to see here. Our story today takes us back more than 2,000 years, to the heart of ancient China. It is the tale of Wu of Han, the emperor who expanded his realm to unimaginable horizons, a man of ambition and paradox, whose reign shaped the destiny of Asia for centuries. Our story takes place in Chang'an, known today as Xi'an, in the year 156 before Christ. At that time, the city was already the political and cultural center of the Han dynasty, one of the most enduring empires in Chinese history. Imagine the bustling markets, the palaces with their red lacquered walls, and the scholars walking through courtyards lined with carved stone lions. This was the world into which a child named Lu Che was born, a boy who would one day become Emperor Wu of Han. The dynasty was then under the rule of Emperor Jing, his father, who had himself inherited the throne from his own father, Emperor Wen. This lineage placed Lu Che directly in the line of succession, though not immediately as the chosen heir. His mother, Empress Wang Ji, played a decisive role in his early life. Historical texts such as records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian describe her as intelligent and politically astute, a woman who navigated the dangerous waters of court intrigue with skill. Could anyone imagine that her son would carry her ambition to heights she could not even dream? The Han dynasty at that time was consolidating power after periods of instability. The court was divided between factions, each seeking influence over the emperor. Lu Che grew up observing this environment, where whispers in palace corridors could decide the fate of ministers and generals. How would this atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry shape the character of a child destined to rule? The Imperial Palace in Chang'an was a world apart, where golden screens separated nobles from commoners, and where rituals dictated every gesture. Lu Che, still a boy, would have been surrounded by half-brothers and sisters, many of them potential rivals. His father, Emperor Jing, was known for his efforts to reduce heavy taxes and for suppressing noble rebellions, but he also left behind a court filled with tension. Scholars such as Mark Edward Lewis, in his book The Early Chinese Empires, Qin and Han, highlight that the Han court was a place where education, rituals, and hierarchy defined destiny. In this world, Lu Che's childhood was not only privileged but also perilous. The young prince was both protected by his mother's influence and threatened by the complex web of alliances that shifted daily within the palace. From his earliest days, Lu Che displayed qualities that distinguished him. Sources describe him as intelligent, curious, and determined. He was not the eldest son, nor the immediate heir, but he carried within him an energy that set him apart. Did his parents already sense that this child would one day surpass all others? Family ties in the imperial household were never simple. Brothers competed for attention, mothers defended their children's claims to the throne, and every gesture could be interpreted as loyalty or betrayal. Lu Che's siblings included princes from different mothers, each representing a faction at court. This created a climate of constant vigilance. The political situation around the time of Lu Che's birth was one of both opportunity and risk. The dynasty had secured internal stability after years of rebellion, but threats from the northern nomadic tribes, especially the Xiongnu, remained constant. Even as a child, Lu Che would have heard stories of battles on the empire's frontiers. How might these tales of danger and conquest have ignited the imagination of a boy born to rule? In Chang'an, temples rose to honor ancestors, while Confucian scholars debated with legalist officials about the best way to govern. Lu Che grew up in a place where ideas mattered as much as swords. This exposure to competing visions of governance would later influence his reign. As Michael Lowy observes in the Cambridge History of China, the Han dynasty stood at a crossroads between tradition and innovation, and young Lu Che embodied this tension. By the time Lu Che reached adolescence, it was clear that he was no ordinary prince. His sharp mind and ability to navigate conversations with elders impressed tutors and courtiers alike. His destiny, however, was far from certain. At that stage, the line of succession pointed elsewhere. Yet history has a way of surprising us. Would this boy, seemingly in the background, eventually rise to the highest throne? The answer awaited in the chapters of fate yet to unfold. And so, the story of Wu of Han begins not in conquest or decree, but in the quiet halls of Chang'an, where a child observed, learned, and prepared unknowingly for a future that would change the map of Asia. What twists of fortune would bring this boy from the shadows of the court to the very center of power? Our story now continues inside the palace of Chang'an, where young Lu Che spent his formative years. The Imperial Palace was not only a home but a theater of constant politics, filled with rituals, competition, and ambition. From the moment he could walk, Lu Che was immersed in a world where every word carried weight and every gesture was observed. What does it mean to grow up in such an environment, where childhood games are played under the gaze of ministers, guards, and rivals? The role of his mother, Empress Wang Ji, was decisive. She had secured her position as empress through careful alliances and strategic moves. In the book Han Dynasty, History of China's First Golden Age by Charles Holcomb, the author notes that the empress's power often determined the future of her children. For Lu Che, his mother's influence provided protection against rivals who might have wished to see another heir rise. Still, this protection came at a cost. Constant exposure to political struggles. Education was at the heart of his upbringing. Confucian tutors taught him the classics, emphasizing filial piety, moral rectitude, and the importance of harmony in society. Imagine the young prince reciting passages from the Analects of Confucius, learning that a ruler who governs by virtue is like the North Star, steadfast and admired by all. Would these words truly shape him, or would the harsh realities of power force him into choices far from virtue? In addition to Confucian teachings, he was exposed to legalist ideas which emphasized law, punishment, and absolute authority. This dual education gave Lu Che both a moral compass and a practical understanding of control. Historian Michael Lowy, in The Government of the Qin and Han Empires, highlights how this combination of ideologies created emperors who were at once idealists and pragmatists. For Lu Che, the seed of ambition was being watered by these competing philosophies. Life in the court was never peaceful. Factions struggled for influence. Ministers whispered strategies behind silk curtains. Generals sought favor, while scholars argued over rituals. The young prince, though still a child, witnessed these disputes firsthand. He learned that words could be as powerful as weapons, and silence could sometimes be the most dangerous answer. How could a child not be shaped by this constant duel of ideas and ambitions? He also grew up among other princes, many of whom were older and seen as more likely heirs to the throne. These siblings were not only companions but competitors. Rivalries developed in subtle ways, over tutors' praise, over ceremonial roles, over attention from the emperor. To survive, Lu Che had to sharpen his ability to observe and adapt. Did he already sense that the throne would one day be his, or was he simply preparing for whatever destiny awaited? One of the most influential figures in his education was a Confucian scholar named Dong Zhongshu, whose writings would later reshape the empire. Though Lu Che was still a boy, the intellectual environment created by men like Dong left an imprint. The Confucian vision of a moral ruler, chosen by the mandate of heaven, resonated with him. Later in life, he would make Confucianism the ideological foundation of the state. But as a child, it was only one of the many voices whispering in his ears. The court was also a place of spectacle. Ceremonies marked the seasons, sacrifices honored ancestors, and military parades displayed the might of the empire. Young Lu Che observed these rituals, understanding that power was not only about decisions but also about appearances. The emperor had to be seen as strong, generous, and chosen by heaven. These lessons in symbolism would stay with him throughout his reign. At the same time, his personality began to reveal itself. Sima Qian, in the records of the Grand Historian, describes him as ambitious and determined even in youth. He was quick to learn, eager to debate, and sometimes impatient with those who did not match his energy. Unlike some of his siblings, who preferred quiet lives of comfort, Liu Che sought challenges. Could it be that even as a child he longed for greatness? Yet danger was never far away. The court was filled with intrigue. Assassinations, forced suicides, and sudden dismissals were not uncommon. A careless word could end a career or a life. Liu Che grew up understanding that trust was rare and alliances fragile. This sharpened his instinct for caution, but also his talent for bold decisions when the moment required. The political landscape of the empire during his youth was shaped by the influence of the Seven Kingdoms, powerful regional lords who had once challenged imperial authority. Though suppressed by Emperor Jing, their shadow still hung over the court. Liu Che, listening to these stories, learned that emperors could not simply rely on bloodlines. They had to prove their strength to hold the empire together. At times, the young prince must have wondered, what would happen to him in this vast machinery of power? Would he remain a secondary figure, overshadowed by elder brothers? Or would destiny find a way to place him in the center of history? These questions, though unspoken, linger in the way historians interpret his childhood. By the time Liu Che entered his teenage years, his character was already marked by ambition, intelligence, and a sense of destiny. He had absorbed the lessons of Confucian morality and legalist discipline. He had watched his mother navigate court intrigues with precision. He had learned to compete with siblings and to listen carefully to the whispers of ministers. The boy who had once been one among many princes was slowly becoming a figure to be noticed. Ministers began to see his sharpness. His mother nurtured his ambitions, and the court started to whisper his name with both hope and fear. Would this boy, still years from the throne, be able to outmaneuver rivals and seize the greatest prize of all? And so, as Liu Che stood on the edge of adolescence, his future was uncertain but promising. Every day in the palace was a lesson, every ceremony a rehearsal for power. What turn of events would transform this ambitious youth into the emperor who would define an era? Our story now shifts to the critical turning point when the young Prince Liu Che moved from being one among many in the palace to becoming heir apparent. The year was 140 before Christ, and the court of Chang'an pulsed with uncertainty. Emperor Jing, his father, was still alive, but questions about succession were unavoidable. Who would inherit the dragon throne? Would it be one of the elder brothers, already groomed for power, or the ambitious but younger Liu Che? At the beginning, Liu Che was not the obvious choice. The line of succession pointed to his elder half-brother, Crown Prince Liu Rong, whose mother was favored by Emperor Jing. Liu Rong's position seemed secure, supported by strong factions within the palace. But court politics is rarely simple. Behind the silken curtains of the palace halls, jealousies, rivalries, and accusations shaped the future of the dynasty. Could a single accusation destroy a prince's claim? The fall of Crown Prince Liu Rong came swiftly. Historical records such as Shiji by Sima Qian describe how his mother, the favored consort Lady Li, became embroiled in conflict with Empress Wang Ji, Liu Che's mother. Accusations of witchcraft, immorality, and arrogance swirled through the court. In a society where omens and rituals carried great weight, such charges were devastating. Emperor Jing, swayed by both evidence and politics, stripped Liu Rong of his position. Suddenly, the path to the throne opened, but only for one bold enough to seize it. Empress Wang Ji moved carefully. She sought alliances with powerful ministers, including the influential courtier Tian Fun, her own brother. This network of supporters pushed Liu Che's claim, presenting him as virtuous, intelligent, and destined for greatness. The arguments were not only personal but cosmic. Confucian scholars interpreted celestial signs, claiming that heaven's mandate favored Liu Che. How could anyone oppose a child believed to be chosen by the heavens themselves? At just 15 years old, Liu Che was declared heir apparent. Imagine the immense weight of that moment. A boy, still in the process of learning statecraft, now burdened with the responsibility of ruling one of the largest empires in the world. Did he feel fear or only ambition? Did he see the dangers of succession, or only the horizon of conquest. The ceremony of succession was as much performance as it was politics. Officials bowed deeply, acknowledging Lu Che as the future son of heaven. Musicians played solemn hymns, while sacrifices were offered to ancestors to bless the decision. In this atmosphere, Lu Che's name echoed through the marble courtyards of Chang'an. From that day on, he was no longer merely a prince. He was the emperor-in-waiting. But power always brings challenges. Being heir meant inheriting both allies and enemies. Rival factions within the court resented the fall of Crown Prince Lu Rong and saw Lu Che as an untested boy elevated by his mother's cunning. Ministers whispered doubts about his youth, his temperament, and his ability to rule. Could such a young man hold together the vast Han Empire, threatened on its borders by the powerful Xiongnu and within by rebellious nobles? The years between his designation as heir and his actual enthronement were crucial. During this time, Lu Che observed closely, learning the mechanics of governance from his father. Emperor Jing emphasized frugality, discipline, and balance. He often warned against excessive wars or burdensome taxation. Yet, as later historians like Hans Bielenstein in The Bureaucracy of Han Times note, Lu Che absorbed these lessons but also formed his own vision. An empire that expanded beyond what anyone thought possible. In these years, Lu Che also deepened his intellectual formation. Tutors exposed him to history, philosophy, and military theory. He studied the campaigns of past dynasties, including the Qin, whose ambition had unified China but whose excesses led to collapse. Did Lu Che wonder if he could repeat their triumphs without their downfall? At the same time, his character sharpened. Accounts portray him as decisive, sharp-tongued, and unwilling to tolerate incompetence. He displayed flashes of impatience with cautious officials, preferring bold action. The young heir was beginning to reveal the traits of the emperor he would become: ambitious, unrelenting, and unwilling to accept limits. In one telling episode, court debates raged about how to deal with the northern nomads, the Xiongnu. Older ministers advised negotiation and tribute, believing peace was cheaper than war. But Lu Che, still only a teenager, argued that only strength could secure the empire. According to Sima Qian, his words foreshadowed the military campaigns that would later define his reign. Could it be that even before wearing the crown, Lu Che was already envisioning an empire that stretched far beyond its borders? When Emperor Jing died in 141 before Christ, the moment of destiny arrived. At 16 years old, Lu Che ascended the throne as Emperor Wu, the martial emperor. The coronation was a spectacle of power. Golden banners unfurled in the wind, drums thundered through the capital, and sacrifices honored heaven and earth. Ministers and generals knelt before the boy who would soon reshape the map of Asia. Yet beneath the grandeur lay uncertainty. A teenager now sat on the throne of one of the world's greatest empires. Would he be a mere puppet in the hands of his mother and uncles, or would he break free and carve his own path? Would his reign continue the cautious balance of his father, or would he unleash ambitions that none could restrain? This was the moment when Lu Che transformed into Emperor Wu of Han, a ruler who would one day be compared to Alexander the Great or Augustus Caesar in terms of ambition and impact. The empire was vast, the challenges immense, and the opportunities boundless. As the boy-turned emperor looked out over Chang'an, he must have felt both the immensity of the task and the intoxicating taste of power. He had seized the crown through intrigue, fortune, and determination. Now, the question was simple yet profound. How would he wield it? When Emperor Wu of Han, still a teenager, assumed the throne in 141 before Christ, the empire held its breath. A boy of only 16 years now bore the mandate of heaven, entrusted with ruling tens of millions of subjects spread across fertile river valleys, deserts, and mountain frontiers. The question weighed heavily. Would this young ruler follow his father's cautious path, or would he forge something entirely new? The first years of his reign were marked by a delicate balancing act. Powerful relatives, especially his grandmother Empress Dowager Do, still exerted influence. She was deeply attached to Taoist ideals, promoting a policy of minimal government and frugality. But Lu Che, now Emperor Wu, was already restless with such restraint. He believed the empire's destiny was not to remain silent and defensive, but to expand, to conquer, and to assert dominance across Asia. Could such conflicting visions coexist within one court? Court politics during these early years was a battlefield of words rather than swords. Ministers who favored Taoist ideals urged patience, light taxation, and avoidance of costly wars. Others, particularly younger Confucian scholars, whispered that the emperor was destined for greater things. As historian Michael Lowy points out, in the government of the Qin and Han empires, this ideological tension defined the opening phase of Emperor Wu's rule. He listened carefully but also began to craft his own identity as a ruler, one who would be remembered not for restraint but for ambition. A decisive change came after the death of Empress Dowager Do. With her influence gone, Emperor Wu no longer had to yield to Taoist policies. He gradually embraced Confucianism as the guiding ideology of the state. This was not merely philosophical. It was political genius. Confucianism emphasized hierarchy, loyalty, and moral order, values that strengthened imperial authority. By elevating Confucian scholars to positions of power, Emperor Wu ensured a bureaucracy loyal to the throne rather than to regional nobles. As the historian Mark Edward Lewis notes, in the early Chinese empires, Qin and Han, this move laid the foundation for more than 2 millennia of Chinese governance. Reforms followed swiftly. Taxes were reorganized to provide more reliable revenue for the state. The empire established government monopolies on essential goods such as salt and iron. These monopolies not only filled imperial coffers but also weakened wealthy landowners who had previously controlled these resources. Imagine the impact. Ordinary peasants now paid directly into imperial hands, while aristocrats lost part of their wealth and influence. Did this bold strategy create stability, or did it plant seeds of resentment? At the same time, Emperor Wu strengthened central authority by reducing the autonomy of local kings and princes. The empire had been divided into semi-independent fiefdoms under the earlier Han rulers, creating potential threats of rebellion. Through legal reforms and careful appointments, Wu ensured that loyalty to the emperor outweighed loyalty to regional powers. In this way, he tightened his grip on a realm too vast to control by force alone. He also restructured the bureaucracy. Examinations, based on Confucian classics, began to be used as a means of selecting officials. While still limited in scope, these early civil service examinations were revolutionary. They emphasized learning and merit over pure birthright. Could it be that Wu, even as he pursued expansion, was also laying the intellectual foundation for the longest-lasting state system in world history? But politics is never only about laws and taxes. Wu also understood the importance of symbols. He performed elaborate sacrifices to heaven and earth, rituals that reinforced his role as the son of heaven. These ceremonies, described in Sima Qian's records of the Grand Historian, projected power and legitimacy not only to his subjects but also to neighboring states. The emperor was not merely a ruler. He was the bridge between heaven and the mortal world. Not all was smooth. Resistance arose from officials loyal to older traditions. Some criticized the heavy taxation needed to fund his reforms. Others argued that monopolies harmed common people. Yet Wu, decisive and sometimes ruthless, silenced opposition when necessary. His determination to centralize power and prepare the empire for expansion could not be swayed by conservative voices. Cultural policies mirrored his political ambitions. Emperor Wu encouraged Confucian scholars to compile histories, rituals, and moral codes. The empire became a place where culture and statecraft intertwined. Schools flourished, spreading the Confucian vision of order and loyalty. Every new generation of students was, in essence, being molded into servants of the state. Was this not one of his most subtle yet enduring victories? Foreign policy, too, began to shift. Though direct military campaigns had not yet defined his reign, Wu started to prepare. He expanded the training of armies, invested in cavalry, and studied the strategies of nomadic tribes. The northern frontier, threatened by the powerful Xiongnu Confederation, demanded constant vigilance. Though still early in his reign, Emperor Wu signaled his intent. Peace would no longer be purchased with gifts, but secured by strength. By consolidating power at home, Wu created the platform from which his empire would launch outward. His reforms gave him the resources, loyalty, and legitimacy necessary to attempt what few rulers dared: the transformation of China into a superpower of the ancient world. And yet, each decision carried risks. Heavy taxes strained the peasants. Reduced autonomy angered the nobility. Monopolies disrupted local economies. Would these tensions one day erupt into rebellion, or would his iron grip keep them in check? As the young emperor stood in the great halls of Chang'an, looking out over his court of ministers and generals, the future seemed vast, filled with both opportunity and danger. He had centralized power, chosen Confucianism as the ideological backbone of his state, and secured his throne against rivals. The stage was set, but how would this ambitious ruler use the immense power now concentrated in his hands? Would he preserve peace, or would he unleash wars that would reshape the map of Asia? The time had come when Emperor Wu could no longer contain his restless ambition. By the mid-2nd century before Christ, the Empire of Han was strong, its bureaucracy centralized, its coffers replenished, and its armies reorganized. But what use was strength without challenge? The young emperor looked north, where the nomadic confederation of the Xiongnu had long tormented the Chinese frontier. For decades, earlier rulers had chosen diplomacy, offering gifts of silk, grain, and even royal marriages in exchange for uneasy peace. But Emperor Wu, bold and impatient, asked himself, why should the son of heaven pay tribute to nomads? The decision to confront the Xiongnu marked the beginning of his military expansion. According to Sima Qian in the records of the Grand Historian, Wu believed that only war could end the humiliation of constant raids. He ordered the mobilization of large armies and invested in the development of cavalry, adopting techniques from the nomads themselves. Horses, swift and resilient, became the key to warfare on the northern steppes. Could the empire truly defeat a people who lived and breathed on horseback? The first campaigns were costly and uncertain. In one early expedition, Chinese forces advanced into the deserts of the north, but found themselves lured deep into enemy territory. The harsh environment, lack of supplies, and surprise attacks decimated the army. Thousands perished. The court in Chang'an trembled at the news. Had the emperor underestimated his enemies? Yet Wu did not relent. Instead of retreating into diplomacy, he doubled his efforts. His resolve was as unshakable as iron. Gradually, the tide began to turn. By recruiting skilled generals such as Wei Qing and Hua Zubing, Emperor Wu built a military machine capable of matching the Xiongnu. Wei Qing, a man of humble origins, proved his genius in organizing logistics and strategy, ensuring that soldiers had supplies even deep in hostile lands. His nephew, Hua Zubing, became a legendary figure, leading daring cavalry raids that crushed Xiongnu forces in unexpected places. The empire celebrated these victories with songs, poems, and sacrifices. Was this not the beginning of a new golden age of conquest? The campaigns pushed the frontiers outward. Fortifications were strengthened, watchtowers extended, and roads carved through deserts and grasslands. These efforts allowed Chinese armies to penetrate deeper than ever before into the steppes. Historian Nicolas D. Cosmo, in Ancient China and Its Enemies, emphasizes how these wars transformed the Han from a defensive power into an offensive empire, projecting influence across Central Asia. But expansion did not stop at the north. Emperor Wu's gaze also turned southward, toward the lands of modern Guangdong and northern Vietnam. These regions, rich in resources and strategically vital, were inhabited by non-Han peoples who resisted imperial control. Campaigns were launched to subdue them. Dense jungles, torrential rains, and unfamiliar diseases claimed many lives, but the emperor's determination remained unbroken. Gradually, these territories were incorporated into the empire, extending Chinese influence to the shores of the South China Sea. The costs of such wars were immense. Taxes were raised, labor conscription increased, and farmers often saw their sons marched off to distant frontiers. Complaints echoed in villages. Yet in Chang'an, the victories were celebrated as signs of heaven's favor. Was the empire being strengthened, or were the foundations of society being strained? The tension between triumph and exhaustion would haunt Wu's reign. Still, the prestige of the emperor soared. Victories against the Xiongnu in particular carried symbolic power. For centuries, these nomads had been feared as unconquerable. Now, under Wu, they were pushed back, their leaders forced to retreat deeper into the steppes. In court rituals, scholars declared that heaven's mandate had clearly favored the emperor's boldness. The people, though burdened, could not deny the pride of belonging to a realm that no longer bowed to outsiders. The campaigns also brought spoils: horses, precious furs, exotic goods, and captured lands enriched the empire. New trade routes opened, linking China to distant regions. Though the Silk Road was not yet fully developed, its first steps were taken under Emperor Wu's orders. By sending envoys such as Zhang Qian into Central Asia, the emperor sought not only alliances against the Xiongnu but also knowledge of lands and peoples beyond the horizon. What new worlds lay waiting at the edge of the empire's reach? In these early years of expansion, Emperor Wu revealed his true nature. He was not content with stability or modest victories. He pursued total domination, often at great cost. His generals became legends, his enemies dreaded his name, and his empire began to stretch far beyond the traditional heartlands of the Yellow River. Yet with every victory came new challenges. Supply lines that stretched across deserts, soldiers weary from endless campaigns, and subjects groaning under the weight of taxation. Could this balance hold? Or was the emperor sowing the seeds of future unrest? By the close of these initial campaigns, the Han Empire was no longer the cautious, defensive state of his predecessors. It had become a rising military power, feared by enemies and admired by allies. Emperor Wu had chosen the path of expansion, and there was no turning back. The boy who had once recited Confucian verses in the palace now commanded armies that thundered across Asia. But the greatest conquest still lay ahead. How far would this emperor push the limits of his realm, and what price would he be willing to pay for glory? By the middle decades of the 2nd century before Christ, Emperor Wu of Han had already tasted victory against the Xiongnu and extended his authority into the southern regions. Yet for this ruler, victories were never enough. He sought to push the boundaries of the empire further than any predecessor had dared, to transform Han China into the uncontested power of Asia. The following decades became the high tide of his ambition, a period historians later described as the very apex of Han expansion. The most dramatic stage of this expansion remained the struggle with the Xiongnu. These nomadic confederations had long threatened China's northern frontier, raiding settlements and demanding tribute. Emperor Wu's decision to confront them head-on led to a series of campaigns unmatched in scale. Generals such as Wei Qing and Hua Tuobing became household names, celebrated for their victories in the open steppes. In one campaign described in Shiji by Sima Qian, Hua Tuobing led a force that struck deep into enemy territory, killing thousands and capturing nobles of the Xiongnu elite. The shock of these raids reverberated across the steppes. Could the so-called barbarians be finally subdued by imperial might? These triumphs were not merely military. They opened the path to something far more enduring: the Silk Road. Determined to surround the Xiongnu by forging alliances, Emperor Wu dispatched the envoy Zhang Qian to the west. His journey was perilous, filled with captivity and hardship, but it revealed to China the existence of powerful kingdoms in Central Asia. As historian Valerie Hansen notes in The Silk Road, a new history, Zhang Qian's mission marked the beginning of connections that would link China to Persia, India, and eventually the Mediterranean world. What had begun as a strategy against nomads evolved into the birth of a global network of exchange. In the south, Wu pushed further. Campaigns subdued the kingdom of Nanyue, in present-day Guangdong and northern Vietnam. Dense forests and torrential rains made these expeditions grueling. Soldiers fell to disease as often as to enemy spears. Yet the emperor's determination carried through, and the annexation of these lands extended Han authority to the South China Sea. Ports there would later feed into maritime trade networks, complementing the overland Silk Road. Did Wu realize he was laying the foundations of China's future as both a continental and maritime power? To the west, beyond the Jade Gate, the empire expanded into the Heshi Corridor, a vital stretch of territory linking China with Central Asia. Fortresses rose, garrisons were stationed, and settlers moved in. This corridor became the lifeline of the Silk Road, a passage through deserts and mountains where caravans laden with silk, jade, and horses would travel for centuries. Control of this corridor was one of Wu's most strategic achievements, ensuring that Han influence reached as far as modern-day Xinjiang. Even in the northeast, Wu extended his reach. Campaigns were launched into the Korean peninsula, establishing commanderies that tied those lands to Han administration. Though resistance was fierce, the mere presence of Chinese authority in such distant territories testified to the emperor's unrelenting ambition. The map of East Asia was being redrawn under his command. All of this expansion required immense resources. The emperor's administration introduced state monopolies on salt and iron, measures recorded in the Discourses on Salt and Iron, a text compiled after his reign. These monopolies funded military campaigns and infrastructure but also sparked debates. Critics argued that they burdened the people, while supporters insisted they were necessary for the glory and security of the empire. Was Wu safeguarding his people or exploiting them for conquest? Cultural consequences were equally profound. With new territories came new peoples, languages, and traditions. The empire became a mosaic, incorporating tribes of the south, nomads of the steppes, and merchants from distant lands. Confucianism remained the ideological backbone, but diversity tested the limits of imperial unity. Could a single emperor truly bind together such a vast and varied world? The grandeur of the court reflected these triumphs. In Chang'an, ceremonies grew more elaborate, music more splendid, and sacrifices more costly. Foreign envoys arrived with exotic goods, horses from Fergana, spices from India, and even stories of lands far beyond imagination. The emperor, enthroned in his golden palace, became a figure of awe not only within China but across Asia. And yet, behind the splendor lurked shadows. Victories against the Xiongnu came at staggering human cost. Campaigns stretched supply lines across unforgiving deserts, where soldiers starved and froze. In the south, disease ravaged armies. Taxes increased, peasants groaned under corvée labor, and murmurs of discontent spread. Historian Mark Edward Lewis observes in the early Chinese empires that Emperor Wu's policies created an empire at once magnificent and fragile, balancing glory with strain. Still, the emperor pressed on. His vision of expansion seemed boundless. Each conquered frontier brought new horizons to conquer. Each victory raised the expectation of another. The Han Empire, under his reign, became the largest and most powerful state of its time, rivaled only by Rome in the distant west. Yet unlike Rome, the Han had no equal neighbor across their frontiers. Their enemies were scattered, and their potential seemed limitless. Could the empire, swollen to such immensity, sustain itself without tearing apart? By the end of these conquests, the Han borders stretched thousands of miles. From the Korean peninsula in the east to Central Asia in the west, from the steppes of Mongolia to the jungles of Vietnam, the empire's reach was staggering. It was not only a geographic achievement but a psychological one. For the first time, China stood as the central power of the known world, a civilization that commanded respect and fear across continents. As Emperor Wu looked upon the maps laid before him in the palace, redrawn to reflect his conquests, he must have felt both pride and hunger. Pride at what he had achieved, hunger for what still lay beyond. He had reached the apogee of expansion, but apogees are by nature fragile. What would happen when the costs of ambition began to outweigh its rewards? Could the empire continue to grow, or would its own weight drag it down into turmoil? With the empire stretched to its widest borders, Emperor Wu of Han faced a challenge as great as war itself: how to govern such vast lands and peoples. Expansion had brought prestige but also responsibility. Soldiers had marched far, garrisons dotted the frontiers, and merchants now crossed deserts carrying silk and jade. Yet the empire's survival depended not on swords alone, but on stable administration, reliable revenue, and a culture that bound millions together under a single vision. Could Emperor Wu master the art of ruling as effectively as he had mastered the art of conquest? His first tool was finance. The immense cost of campaigns against the Xiongnu and expeditions into the south and west had drained the treasury. To replenish it, Emperor Wu implemented bold measures. State monopolies on iron, salt, and liquor were established, policies later recorded in the Discourses on Salt and Iron, a famous debate between officials and scholars. These monopolies ensured a steady flow of revenue directly into imperial coffers and limited the power of wealthy merchants who might rival the state. But they also brought hardship. Taxes on basic necessities weighed heavily on peasants. Was the price of empire being paid by those least able to afford it? Infrastructure became another priority. Roads, canals, and granaries were built and expanded to ensure the movement of grain and supplies across the empire. The Grand Canal system, though not fully developed until later dynasties, had its foundations in these efforts. Armies required food, cities required stability, and peasants required security from famine. Wu understood that an empire of such magnitude could collapse if grain failed to move from fertile regions to those in need. The investment in infrastructure was a silent weapon of stability. Agriculture, too, received attention. Land was redistributed in some regions to prevent the dominance of large estates. Officials promoted improved irrigation techniques, while agricultural handbooks circulated with advice on planting and harvesting. The emperor understood that his empire's strength lay not only in soldiers but in farmers. If the peasants prospered, the empire endured. If they suffered, rebellion lurked on the horizon. Culturally, Emperor Wu reshaped China in ways that outlasted his conquests. He elevated Confucianism to the status of state orthodoxy. Schools teaching Confucian classics were established, and examinations, though rudimentary, began to test knowledge of these texts for entry into government service. This move marginalized Taoist and legalist factions and created a bureaucratic culture that valued learning, loyalty, and moral order. Historian Michael Lowy notes in the Cambridge History of China that this was perhaps Wu's most enduring legacy, embedding Confucianism at the heart of governance for nearly 2 millennia. At the same time, Emperor Wu promoted the arts. Court music flourished, elaborate dances were performed during ceremonies, and poets celebrated victories in verse. Temples and shrines multiplied, often built to honor heaven, earth, and the spirits believed to protect the empire. These cultural displays were not mere entertainment, they were instruments of legitimacy. Every song sung in praise of the emperor reminded the people that he was the son of heaven. Yet Wu's cultural vision went beyond Confucianism. He was fascinated by omens, rituals, and the supernatural. Astronomers and magicians gained influence at his court, interpreting celestial signs to confirm the emperor's mandate. Eclipses, comets, and strange natural phenomena were studied as messages from heaven. In one instance, after reports of unusual stars, Emperor Wu performed elaborate sacrifices to renew his legitimacy. Did he truly believe in these signs? Or was he using them as political theater to awe his subjects? The intellectual life of the empire also flourished. The records of the grand historian by Sima Qian, The Monumental History of China from Mythical Times to the Han Dynasty, was compiled during Wu's reign. Though Sima Qian later suffered punishment under the emperor, his work became the foundation of Chinese historiography. Ironically, a ruler known for silencing dissent indirectly ensured that history would remember both his triumphs and his flaws. Still, strains within society grew. Heavy taxation, forced labor for military and infrastructure projects, and the monopolies burdened commoners. In villages, discontent simmered. Some peasants abandoned their land, fleeing to remote areas to escape imperial demands. Rebellions remained sporadic, but the social fabric was fraying. The emperor's officials worked tirelessly to suppress unrest, yet the question remained. Could a people continually taxed and conscripted remain loyal? The nobility, too, felt pressure. By reducing their autonomy and strengthening central authority, Wu diminished the power of regional kings. While this secured unity, it bred resentment among elites. The balance between imperial control and aristocratic cooperation was delicate. Too much pressure and the nobility might rebel. Too little and the empire risked fragmentation. Wu walked this tightrope with skill, but not without enemies. Religious and philosophical debates also divided the court. Confucian scholars praised Wu's policies but warned against extravagance. Taoist thinkers criticized his wars and taxes, urging a return to simplicity. Legalist-minded officials argued for stricter laws and harsher punishments. The emperor played these factions against one another, ensuring that none could dominate completely. Was this shrewd governance? Or did it merely conceal tensions that could erupt later? In Chang'an, the capital itself became a symbol of imperial might. Palaces expanded, decorated with gold and jade. Markets bustled with goods from across Asia, horses from the west, spices from the south, and fine textiles from every corner of the empire. Foreign envoys visited the court, dazzled by the grandeur of the Han. The capital was a showcase of wealth, a stage upon which the emperor displayed the success of his policies. Yet the glitter of Chang'an could not hide the empire's underlying contradictions. Glory rested on the suffering of many. Culture flourished even as peasants groaned under burdens. Confucian ideals of benevolence coexisted with legalist practices of control and punishment. Perhaps this was the true paradox of Wu's reign. An empire both enlightened and oppressive, magnificent and merciless. As Emperor Wu looked upon the cultural and administrative order he had built, he could claim triumph. He had secured resources, shaped ideology, and promoted culture. He had turned the Han into not only a military superpower but also a cultural beacon. And yet, one question lingered. Could such an empire, stretched by wars and strained by taxes, endure the weight of its own grandeur? Behind the splendor of the palaces in Chang'an, where golden halls echoed with music and rituals, lay a world of whispered conspiracies, jealous rivals, and dangerous passions. Emperor Wu of Han was not only a ruler of vast territories, but also a man surrounded by family members, consorts, ministers, and enemies, each with their own ambitions. If his armies had to battle the Xiongnu on the steppes, his heart and mind were constantly tested by struggles within the palace walls. Could any throne, no matter how high, ever be safe from the intrigues of those closest to it? One of the central figures in his personal life was Empress Wei Zifu. She began as a humble singer in the household of Princess Pingyang, the emperor's sister. When introduced to Wu, she quickly rose to favor. Her beauty, grace, and humility charmed him, and soon she became his consort. Their union marked one of the most extraordinary love stories of the Han court, proof that even in a palace ruled by power, affection could influence destiny. Eventually, Wei Zifu was elevated to empress, a position that gave her family new status and authority. But in the court of Chang'an, love and politics were inseparable. Would her rise invite admiration or jealousy? Indeed, her ascent created enemies. Other consorts, some supported by powerful factions, resented her influence. Concubines competed fiercely for the emperor's attention, for the birth of a son could mean the birth of a dynasty. In this atmosphere, every gesture was strategic, every smile possibly a trap. The palace became an arena of quiet battles, where poisoned words could be as deadly as poisoned wine. Historian Ban Gu, in the Book of Han, describes how even servants and eunuchs became pawns in these struggles, carrying messages, spreading rumors, or tipping the balance between favor and disgrace. The question of succession only magnified tensions. Emperor Wu fathered several sons by different consorts. The heir apparent, Crown Prince Lu Ju, was born of Empress Wei Zifu. At first, his position seemed secure. He was intelligent, kind-hearted, and supported by his mother. Yet palace intrigue is rarely so simple. Rivals schemed to undermine him, whispering doubts about his abilities and loyalty. Could a boy raised in luxury handle the burdens of empire? Ministers debated in silence, and enemies watched for weakness. The emperor's own personality made the situation more volatile. Ambitious, restless, and often suspicious, he was quick to reward but also quick to punish. His brilliance was matched by paranoia, a trait that grew stronger as he aged. Accusations of witchcraft and treason became weapons wielded within the court. Ministers who once stood high could fall in a single day. Families that had served for generations could vanish overnight. Was Wu defending himself from real threats, or was he haunted by shadows of his own making? Among the most tragic episodes of his reign was the downfall of Crown Prince Lu Ju. Accused of conspiring with sorcerers, the prince found himself cornered by hostile ministers and perhaps even betrayed by the emperor's growing distrust. In 71 before Christ, chaos erupted. Soldiers stormed the prince's residence, and in the struggle, Lu Ju was forced to take his own life. Empress Wei Zifu, overwhelmed by grief and disgrace, also perished soon after. The court was shaken. How could the emperor, once a loving husband and father, preside over such a calamity? This tragedy revealed the corrosive effects of constant intrigue. The emperor's suspicion of witchcraft reflected a broader cultural anxiety of the time. Omens, spells, and celestial signs carried weight in politics, and accusations of using dark arts were powerful tools to eliminate rivals. In the words of historian Michael Lowy, the Han court lived in a climate where fear of the unseen could destroy the strongest of bonds. For Emperor Wu, superstition became both shield and sword, but it cost him dearly in family and loyalty. Beyond succession, his personal relationships shaped policy. Consorts and their families often gained influence through proximity to the emperor. Empress Wei's relatives, for instance, received positions of power, which angered other clans. Each marriage, each child, each appointment became part of a vast chessboard, where alliances rose and fell with dizzying speed. Could an emperor ever separate love from politics when both unfolded under the same gilded roof? The emperor's private life also revealed contradictions. He was capable of deep affection but equally capable of ruthless coldness. He enjoyed music, poetry, and the company of refined artists. Yet he distrusted intellectuals who questioned him. He valued loyalty, but often suspected betrayal even where none existed. The palace chroniclers portray him as a man who embodied both humanity and cruelty, sometimes within the same day. Meanwhile, the wider court reflected his personality. Eunuchs grew in power, controlling access to the emperor. Ministers aligned themselves with factions, defending Confucian principles, legalist strictness, or Taoist restraint. The balance of these forces shifted constantly, leaving the court in a state of permanent tension. Even generals returning victorious from campaigns could fall to intrigue if their glory threatened the emperor's supremacy. Despite the turbulence, rituals continued. The emperor presided over grand ceremonies, sacrifices to heaven, and audiences with envoys. To the outside world, he appeared as the stable son of heaven, unchallenged in authority. Yet behind closed doors, whispers filled the corridors, plotting against rivals, feeding the emperor's doubts, and ensuring that no day in Chang'an was ever without danger. In the midst of victories abroad and splendor at home, Emperor Wu's palace was a place where loyalty could turn into betrayal overnight, where love could end in tragedy, and where ambition consumed even those closest to the throne. Was this the inevitable cost of holding absolute power? Or could the emperor have chosen trust over suspicion, peace over paranoia? As he grew older, the contradictions of his personal life became more visible. Triumphs on the battlefield brought him glory, but losses in his family brought him sorrow. He was the mightiest emperor of his time, yet inside his palace he was often a man at war with shadows. The empire stretched across Asia, but in Chang'an, the emperor wrestled with battles that no army could win. And so the question remained, could a ruler who conquered half the world ever conquer the fears and intrigues of his own court? By the later years of Emperor Wu's reign, the Han Empire stood as a colossus in Asia. Its borders stretched further than any Chinese state had ever dared. Its armies had defeated enemies long considered invincible, and its culture radiated across distant lands. Yet within the heart of the empire, cracks had begun to appear. Glory came with a price, and for Emperor Wu, the final decades of his rule were marked by exhaustion, suspicion, and tragedy. Could an emperor who had conquered so much conquer the weight of his own burdens? The endless wars had drained the treasury. Campaigns against the Xiongnu, expeditions into Central Asia, and annexations in the south had demanded staggering resources. Taxes grew heavier, and corvée labor increased. Farmers across the empire groaned under the strain, often abandoning their lands when they could no longer pay. Villages emptied, fields lay fallow, and famine threatened in some regions. Historian Mark Edward Lewis notes in the early Chinese empires that Wu's policies created a paradox. Victories on the frontiers weakened stability at home. Was the empire being strengthened or slowly bled dry? Dissent began to spread. Peasants, taxed to their limits, sometimes rebelled, though these uprisings were swiftly crushed by imperial forces. The emperor's ministers debated reforms, but Wu remained reluctant to scale back his ambitions. He had built his reputation on expansion and power. To retreat or compromise seemed unthinkable. Yet even the Son of Heaven could not ignore the murmurs of discontent echoing through the countryside. Court politics grew darker. The tragedy of Crown Prince Lu Ju's death still haunted the palace. Empress Wei Zifu's demise left the emperor more isolated than ever. In the absence of trusted family, suspicion became his constant companion. Ministers were accused of treason, generals of disloyalty, and scholars of subversion. Some were executed, others exiled, their families destroyed in purges that spread fear through the capital. Was Wu defending his throne from real threats, or was he a man consumed by paranoia? The obsession with witchcraft and omens deepened. Accusations of sorcery became tools for rivals to eliminate one another, and the emperor himself often believed that unseen forces conspired against him. Sima Qian, the great historian, fell victim to these years of suspicion. When he defended a disgraced general, the emperor condemned him to castration, a punishment Sima Qian endured to complete his records of the grand historian. Ironically, this decision ensured that Emperor Wu's reign, with all its triumphs and flaws, would be remembered for millennia. Did Wu realize that by silencing one voice, he immortalized another? As the emperor aged, his health declined. Sources suggest he suffered from fatigue, bouts of illness, and mental strain. Yet his determination never wavered. He continued to issue decrees, oversee ceremonies, and demand obedience. To his people, he remained a figure of awe, seated on the throne of jade, surrounded by ministers who bowed low and dared not meet his gaze. But behind the facade, the weight of decades of war and intrigue pressed heavily upon him. Economic reforms were attempted in these years to stabilize the realm. Grain reserves were established to control famine, and monopolies adjusted to relieve some pressure on peasants. Yet the balance was fragile. The population was weary, the treasury thin, and the empire stretched across immense distances. Could any system sustain such weight indefinitely? Culturally, Wu's court remained dazzling. Rituals continued, music resounded in palaces, and scholars debated philosophy. But the tone had shifted. Where once there had been optimism and confidence, now there was caution and fear. Ministers spoke carefully, afraid of offending the emperor. Families who had once thrived on imperial favor now lived in dread of sudden accusations. Even victories seemed muted, overshadowed by the memory of loss. One of the most telling moments of these years came in his reflections on succession. With the death of Crown Prince Lu Ju, the question of who would inherit the throne grew urgent. The emperor hesitated, shifting favor between different sons, uncertain whom to trust. Each choice carried risks, each candidate enemies. The struggle for succession poisoned the court, turning brothers against one another and fueling further intrigue. Could the emperor secure a stable future for the dynasty, or was he sowing the seeds of chaos for those who followed? And yet, despite exhaustion and decline, Wu remained resolute. In public, he continued to embody the role of the Son of Heaven, performing sacrifices, issuing laws, and upholding the grandeur of the throne. He never surrendered the image of strength, even when his body weakened. Historian Michael Lowy describes these years as a mixture of glory and shadow, a time when the emperor's power remained vast but his control increasingly fragile. As he looked back on decades of rule, what did Wu see? He had expanded the empire to unprecedented size, reshaped its administration, and left a cultural legacy that would endure for centuries. Yet he had also burdened his people, alienated his family, and lived in suspicion. Was he a hero who secured China's place in history, or a tyrant who sacrificed too much for glory? Perhaps he was both. By the final years, the emperor was a man alone. His trusted generals had passed away, his beloved empress gone, his heir dead by tragic misfortune. He had victories to his name but grief in his heart. Surrounded by courtiers who bowed deeply but rarely spoke honestly, he bore the solitude of absolute power. Could any man, no matter how mighty, escape such loneliness? The once ambitious youth who had ascended the throne at 16 was now an aging ruler, haunted by memories of triumph and loss. The empire he had built stood magnificent, but the cracks beneath its surface grew wider. Would it endure after his death, or collapse under the weight of its own greatness? The stage was set for the final act of his life, a chapter where even the mightiest emperor would face the limits of human strength. By the final years of Emperor Wu's reign, the brilliance of his conquests had dimmed under the heavy shadows of age, suspicion, and grief. The once vigorous ruler who had ridden alongside his generals and ordered campaigns across Asia now found himself increasingly frail, confined to the grand halls of Chang'an. The empire he had built stretched wider than ever before, but the man who embodied it carried the weight of exhaustion. Could even the Son of Heaven resist the relentless march of time? The court in these years became a place of silence and caution. Ministers bowed deeply but spoke carefully, measuring every word. Fear of accusation lingered in every conversation. The purges of recent decades had left scars. Many families had lost fathers, sons, and brothers to charges of treason or witchcraft. The death of Crown Prince Lu Ju remained an open wound, and whispers in the capital reminded everyone that even the emperor's own blood was not safe from suspicion. Wu himself, though still commanding loyalty, seemed haunted by regret. Did he wonder if he had sacrificed too much, his family, his people's peace, for the sake of glory? Physically, the emperor declined. Ancient texts suggest that he suffered from illness and fatigue. His once commanding presence was diminished, yet rituals continued. Even when his body faltered, he insisted on performing sacrifices to heaven and earth, reaffirming his role as mediator between the divine and the mortal. Such ceremonies, though exhausting, were essential to maintain legitimacy. Could the empire hold together if the Son of Heaven showed weakness? The question of succession dominated the last years. With the death of Crown Prince Lu Ju, uncertainty plagued the court. Wu considered various heirs, weighing loyalty, ability, and factional support. Each choice threatened to destabilize the court further, for rival families and ministers rallied behind different candidates. Eventually, he named the young Lu Fuling, a child, as his successor. To secure the boy's future, Wu appointed trusted ministers to act as regents. This decision, recorded in Ban Gu's Book of Han, reflected both pragmatism and desperation. Did the emperor believe that careful planning could protect his dynasty from the storms he had unleashed? The empire itself, though vast, bore the marks of strain. Taxation had impoverished many peasants, and frontier settlements required constant defense. The costs of expansion weighed heavily. Yet, despite these difficulties, the Han remained the dominant power in East Asia. Envoys still arrived from distant kingdoms, bringing tribute and exotic goods. The Silk Road, though still in its infancy, promised a future of connection and wealth. Wu's dream of a universal empire had, in many ways, been realized. But would his successors be able to sustain it without breaking the backs of their people? In his last years, Emperor Wu is said to have reflected on his mistakes. Some accounts suggest he issued decrees to reduce burdens on the peasants, attempting to correct the excesses of his earlier policies. Historians debate whether these acts were genuine repentance or simply attempts to preserve stability as his life neared its end. Whatever the case, they revealed a ruler aware of his limits. For decades, he had sought to bend the world to his will. Now, he acknowledged that even an emperor must sometimes yield. The atmosphere in Chang'an grew heavy as rumors of the emperor's failing health spread. Courtiers whispered about omens in the skies, strange stars, eclipses, and unusual weather. In the culture of the Han, these signs were believed to reflect heaven's judgment on the ruler. Did heaven now signal the end of Wu's mandate? Ritual specialists scrambled to interpret the portents, but the truth was undeniable. The emperor's time was nearing its close. In 87 before Christ, Emperor Wu died, bringing to an end one of the longest and most consequential reigns in Chinese history. He had ruled for more than 50 years, longer than nearly any emperor before or after. His death was marked by elaborate ceremonies, sacrifices, and mourning that echoed across the empire. In villages and cities, common people grieved a ruler whose policies had brought both pride and suffering. Ministers bowed their heads, acknowledging the passing of a man who had dominated their world for half a century. The empire he left behind was immense, powerful, and deeply marked by his vision. It stood as the largest state in Asia, a military superpower, and a cultural beacon. Yet it also carried the burdens of heavy taxation, social unrest, and the memory of palace tragedies. Wu's successors would inherit both his triumphs and his troubles. The question was no longer whether he could hold the empire together, but whether anyone else could. As the morning drums sounded in Chang'an and the emperor was laid to rest in his grand mausoleum, the people of Han China faced the future without the man who had defined their era. For more than 5 decades, he had been the embodiment of ambition, conquest, and authority. Now, silence filled the throne room where his voice had once commanded armies and dictated the fate of millions. The legacy of Emperor Wu was not simple. He was remembered as a conqueror who expanded China's frontiers to unprecedented limits, as a visionary who made Confucianism the backbone of the state, but also as a ruler whose suspicion destroyed his family and whose wars strained his people. Was he a hero or a tyrant? Perhaps history shows he was both, a man whose greatness could not be separated from his flaws. And so, the reign of Emperor Wu ended, leaving behind a transformed empire and questions that would echo for centuries. Could any ruler after him balance ambition with restraint? Could any empire continue to expand without breaking under its own weight? The answers would belong to future generations, but the story of Wu of Han remained carved into the stones of Chang'an, into the deserts of the Silk Road, and into the memory of China itself. What do you think of a ruler who expanded an empire to its greatest heights, yet lost his own family to suspicion and fear? Was Emperor Wu of Han a visionary who secured China's greatness, or a man blinded by ambition? If you are not yet subscribed, join us and support this project. Thank you for watching. You will enjoy our next video. Tang Taizong, the emperor who united military strength with cultural wisdom. Tang Taizong's story reveals how power can be tempered by intellect, how a ruler forged stability from chaos, and how culture and war walked hand in hand in one of China's greatest dynasties. Subscribe so you do not miss it when it is released. And here are 2 more videos that you will probably enjoy. We will meet you there.